Okay, so leadership. Welcome back. An alternative interpretation of both the 1983 and 2019 elections is that it was not Labour's policies which cost them the election, but rather the image of the party leaders. Many commentators have suggested that election campaigns are becoming more and more presidential in style, with the image and charisma of the individual leader becoming ever more important. Famously, Labour won a landslide election in 1945 under the leadership of Clement Attlee, considered rather a boring public figure, despite being up against Winston Churchill, considered one of the most inspiring and charismatic prime ministers of the 20th century. That was, however, before the days of television, and people's political views were much more likely to be informed by their own personal connections in trade unions or the local conservative associations than transmitted through the media. Since then, people's views of each party are much more likely to be influenced by the image of the party leader. And this is particularly the case since 2010, when the first presidential-style televised leadership debates began. The performance of Nick Clegg in these 2010 debates was considered key to the Liberal Democrats' success in that election, which led to the formation of a coalition government between them and the Conservatives. To return to those disastrous elections for Labour in 1983 and 2019 then, in both cases Labour had leaders who were not considered to be terribly charismatic or charming, nor great public speakers. Michael Foot in 1983 and Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, both of whom were presented as bumbling or dithering by their opponents, and in both cases were up against very domineering, powerful personalities leading the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher in 1983 and Boris Johnson in 2019. Indeed, the poor performance of Labour in 2019 compared to 2017 can in part be explained by the poor image of then Conservative leader Theresa May as compared to her replacement Boris Johnson. When Corbyn was up against a similarly uncharismatic figure like Theresa May, his party didn't fare so badly, but when up against a real showman like Johnson, he could not compete. Likewise, in 2015, the Conservatives' surprise election victory was thought by some to have been the result of the sheer unstatesmanlike qualities of Labour leader Ed Miliband. In contrast, in 1997, when Labour was led by the charismatic young heartthrob Tony Blair and the Conservatives by the grey, monotone John Major, Labour won a landslide victory. So the image of the party leader can, it seems, have a huge effect on how people cast their vote. Now let's dig a little deeper into how leadership played out in the 2019 election. One interesting thing is that both party leaders, Corbyn and Johnson, were actually very unpopular according to opinion polls. Deborah Mattinson, who ran focus groups amongst Red Wall voters, that is voters in the so-called Labour's Red Wall, traditional Labour strongholds in the North and the Midlands, many of which actually were taken by the Conservatives in the 2019 election, but which had always been traditionally Labour seats. So Mattinson, in her focus groups of Red Wall voters, asked them what would be the attributes they most closely associated with Corbyn, and which would be the attributes they most closely associate with Johnson. Now here's a question for you. Which party leader do you think had deceitful, out of touch, and dangerous as the top three attributes voters associated with them? Pause the video and have a think. Who do you think it was, Corbyn or Johnson? Did you do it? Well, whatever you said, you were right. The focus groups attributed deceitful, out of touch, and dangerous as the top three attributes of both Corbyn and Johnson. So these were two deeply unpopular leaders in 2019. Both went into the campaign with what's called negative poll ratings. In other words, more people finding them, more people not supporting them than supporting them. Yet it seems that Corbyn's unpopularity was much more electorally damaging. Lord Ashcroft's polling of over 1,000 voters who switched from Labour to another party in the 2019 election found that 3/4 of them gave Jeremy Corbyn as the number one reason for changing their vote. So what was it about Corbyn that voters found so off-putting? It seems it came down to mainly two issues. Firstly, allegations that he had not properly dealt with allegations of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And this was a story that ran for years, really, almost every day on the front page for many weeks at a time. And secondly, allegations that he was essentially unpatriotic. Corbyn had a history of standing with the victims of colonial aggression, for example, in Ireland, in Palestine, in South Africa, in the Chagos Islands, whose inhabitants were ethnically cleansed by the UK state in the 1960s and 70s to make way for a US military base, and in other places. He had also been a consistent opponent of British military aggression and had voted against British bombing campaigns against Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Syria and Yemen, and was one of only 13 MPs who voted against the British bombing of Libya in 2011. In addition, many Red Wall voters were dismayed that, unlike Boris Johnson, Corbyn had not come out against the prosecution of British soldiers responsible for massacres in Northern Ireland, which they saw as a betrayal of the UK armed forces. All of this led many to believe that he was unpatriotic, that he did not support the UK armed forces, and he was sympathetic to terrorists such as IRA or Hamas. Jenny Chapman, for example, former Labour MP for Darlington, said that when she was canvassing in December 2019, quote, "On every other door it was, we can't vote for you while he's the leader, he's a terrorist." Gareth Snell, former Labour MP for Stoke-on-Trent, said, quote, They thought Jeremy Corbyn was more interested in what was happening in far-flung corners of the world than about what was going on in Britain." These perceptions were particularly damaging in the so-called Red Wall seats in the North and the Midlands, the traditional Labour strongholds that were taken by the Conservatives in 2019, as these seats tend to be much more patriotic and pro-armed forces than other parts of the country. The key moment when Corbyn's poll ratings fell to below those of Theresa May was in March 2018 following the Salisbury poisonings, when Corbyn suggested that Russia should not be condemned for the attacks until firm evidence had proved that they were responsible. This was seen by many as evidence of weakness and an unwillingness to stand up for Britain against its enemies. His poll ratings never recovered, and he began the 2019 election campaign with a -76 satisfaction rating amongst voters, the lowest of any opposition leader since records began. So clearly voting behaviour is heavily dependent on voters' perceptions of the party leader. In a country such as Britain, or at least in England with its deep history of empire, a basic criteria for popularity appears to be a commitment to ongoing and historic British military operations, and Corbyn's history of antipathy to them arguably doomed his electoral chances. And yet this still raises the issue of why Corbyn's reputation as an unpatriotic sympathiser with Britain's victims and enemies was such an electoral liability in 2019 compared to 2017. Now this is where the media comes in, the focus of our next video.